hybrid flame of 3030 in the year 3030. The night over the Pacific hung like velvet, and the floating city of Neo-Tokyo drifted in it a lantern adrift on a dark sea. Wind sang under the aero bridges, turbines breathed, and the slow heartbeat of a million lights pulsed across the skin of the city. People slept. Artificial gardens whispered. The ocean below flickered with bioluminescence, as if the stars had slipped and fallen into the water, on the quiet rim of the city. In a lab shaped like a seashell, a man sat awake. Dr. Elian Kale did not sleep much. He had the look of someone who had traded years for answers. Attentive eyes, a careful mouth, the patience of a person who knows that truth takes its own time. On his desk, along a long arc of glass, patterns of pale blue ran like frost. They were not frost. They were living scripts, bioelectric glyphs that drifted slowly along the surface of a containment cradle, curling around a sleeping girl. She was 19 by any calendar, but her body held other measures, waves and cycles that obeyed a clock that had started in a storm of distant stars. Her name was Lyra. A white shawl slid off her shoulder as she turned, and even asleep, she looked like she was listening, as if a song were being played just at the edge of hearing. When she exhaled, the glyphs brightened in a sigh of light. On each wrist were faint silver scales that caught the lamplight like fish in a shallow stream. Her hair had a quiet sheen, and her eyes, when open, were the deep blue of the night sea when lightning walks on it. Elian watched the glyphs, then the sky beyond the glass. He had learned the habit of listening to two things at once, because Lyra dreamt with one foot in this world and one in another. She was human. She was also more than human. Those truths had never cancelled each other. They braided. The lab's clock chimed softly. Midnight had passed. Elian stood, stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, and opened the vented window to the ocean air. Coolness slid in, carrying salt and the faint tank of ozone. Far below, a cargo skiff drifted, its bow light swinging a lazy arc. Lyra opened her eyes. "You're awake," Elian said, and kept his voice low, because the night asked for low voices. "I heard the water," she said. Her voice had echoes in it, musical, not mechanical. She sat up, pressing her palms to the glass. The blue glyphs fluttered at her touch, like birds rising from a field. "It's loud tonight. It's just the tide," Elian said, and wished it were true. He had felt it all day, like a pressure change before a storm. In the afternoon, the orbital net had lit with messages. Strange magnetics. Spikes like flares, but not flares. Words no one wanted to write. Possible incursion. Lyra turned, looking at him. "They're calling again." He nodded, because there was no use pretending. "How long?" "Since sunset," she said, like a song from under the floor. She lifted her hands, and the glyphs arranged in a neat helix before dissolving. "If I listen too closely, I get dizzy. You don't have to listen. I don't know how not to." She smiled, and for a moment she was very much a girl in a shawl and not a wonder of biology. "Tell me one of your sea stories." Elian leaned against the window frame and looked at the water until he could put the scene into words. "When I was a child," he said, "I spent one summer walking the tidal flats where my mother mapped the growth of crystal barnacles. They're old, almost as old as the rocks. When the tide pulls away, they open not like mouths, but like flowers. You wouldn't think rock could move like that, but it can if you give it enough time." Lyra listened, her chin on her knees. "Maybe I'm a barnacle," she said lightly. "A very fast barnacle, maybe," Elian said, and smiled back. but his chest was tight. He had spent years learning her rhythms, where to touch the routine and where to leave it alone. He had learned when to tell the truth. He was grateful, as always, that Lyra never demanded it be more beautiful than it was. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked. His eyes flicked to the sky. "Yes, but that doesn't say what they'll do." "They're angry," she said, and laid a hand over her heart. "It hurts in here when they turn their faces." That was how she described it. The dragons had faces without faces, and turned them without turning. Lyra had words for it, because you have too. But they were bridges spanning a canyon no one else could see. He watched the slowly altering glyphs, and thought about the day he had first seen an alien lattice unfold in an experiment chamber, like a flower made of lighter seed of something that had waited through millennia of cold space to be woken by the right pattern of warmth and curiosity. That day felt close tonight. "Sleep if you can," he said. "I'll be here," she nodded. But neither of them slept near dawn. When the line of the horizon sharpened like a blade, the call became a sound anyone could hear. It came as a trembling through the sodium lamps of the city, as a hum in the bridge cables, as a ripple in the ocean that moved in the wrong direction. It came as a shadow across the stars. The orbital net filled with a single word that uncoiled and uncoiled through 1,000 channels. Dragons. On the morning side of the world. In desert cities and ice cities and garden cities, people went still and looked up. Some cried. Some held hands. Many simply watched as the sky opened like a paper lantern and shapes like rivers of glass spilled through. They were longer than towers and moved with the slow grace of kites. Their edges broke sunlight into rainbows. When they breathed, the air lit like metal in a forge. Neo-Tokyo's shield expanded, a transparent petal over the city. Interceptors climbed, bright insects against the falling gods. The dragons turned, not with anger, not with any human emotion at all, but with intent. Their mouths opened, and something that was not flame laid itself against the shield and pressed. It held, then trembled. Elian and Lyra stood side by side at the window. The sea hissed like paper. "Verenth," she whispered, and something in the lab went very cold. "He is the oldest. He is the voice everyone steps aside for." Elian reached for her hand and found it hot, not with fever but with energy, as if a small sun were caught beneath her skin. "Is he speaking to you?" "He sees me. He knows me." She drew a slow, steady breath, like a singer preparing to place a long note. "He says, you were stolen." Elian closed his eyes and opened them again. "You do not argue with a tidal wave. You look for the shore, then tell him the other truth," he said evenly. "Tell him you are loved." Lyra's lips quirked. "You think that will matter?" "I think it matters to you." He looked down at the glyphs, which had begun to braid themselves into something resembling a map. Threaded through the lab were cables that led to a ship cradled below, the Astrovox, a small vessel with shields heavier than its voice suggested, with a soul of stubborn engines. Rhea Solon had once taken Elian aside and said, in her cool way, "Don't make me regret giving you this," and then unbent enough to add, "I trust you with what I can't explain to anyone else." The shield trembled again, and the city made a sound like a frightened animal. "They will break it soon," Lyra said. There was no panic in her tone, only calm observation, like a scientist taking notes. Calm ran through her like a river, even when the bed of that river shook. "Then we don't stay," Elian said. "We go to them." She looked at him the way a child looked at a candle, surprised and delighted. To Orion. To wherever they are coming from, he said. You told me once they sing in 2 places at once. Perhaps their anchor is there. Perhaps we can tug it. Lyra slipped off the cradle, bare feet silent on the floor. Blue light poured along the path, her toes traced, not because she willed it, but because this was the language of her cells. They won't like it, she said. They don't have to. But they've called you for years. Let's answer properly. He gathered a small pack, med components, a sleeve of protein sheets, a band with Ria's private channel embedded like a secret vein of gold. He hesitated. He looked back at the lab, the plants growing in the corner under a gentle lamp, the wall with its series of quiet sketches, the sketch of Lyra asleep with a book on her chest, and beside it the crude drawing of a dragon done in a lifted children's style. Because once Lyra had asked for a picture and he had tried to make the thing in her head into lines on a page. He had kept it, badly drawn and sincere. The Astrovox accepted them like a sigh. They strapped in. Lyra laid her palms on the console and the ship's lights softened. She hummed a single note and a column of numbers folded into a door. We're going up, she said, and the city fell away, and the shield and the sky turned thin and then black, and the earth was a bead of glass beneath them. The dragons were fleets now, long bodies moving through near orbit like reflections in water. They did not strike the ship. They watched, as curious as sharks. Lyra looked back at them. Elian had seen her give the same attentive look to a moth caught on a windowsill. Virenth speaks, she said softly. He says, little thief, you wear our songs. Elian said, answer, I was given a song without being asked, but I choose how to sing it. Lyra's eyes brightened. He does not understand choosing. She tilted her head as if listening to rain. He says choosing is the fantasy of the weak. Then he has never watched a barnacle, Elian murmured. Open a corridor if you can. Space is not corridors and doors, but we use the words that fit in our mouths. The Astrovox followed a seam of magnetics, Lyra guiding them, her right hand hovering over the controls, her left hand resting lightly on Elian's wrist, as if to keep him anchored to a familiar gravity. They slid toward a region of space ancient charts called Orion's Rift. Though it had many names, and none of them matched the strange geography of it, a valley of pale glass. A ribboned emptiness, the hollow of a throat, inside. The ship's instruments went quiet one by one, not from failure but from reverence. Patterns that had been numbers became harmonics. The rift unfolded a structure that was neither craft nor creature, but a colony of both, an arc grown like a cathedral from lattice of memory. Its surfaces flowed like ice that remembered being sea. Elian felt his throat tighten and his eyes burn with the old thrill of seeing. Something that makes your idea of the world bend and stand taller. The dragons slowed and circled the ark like fish around a reef. Can you speak with them here? He asked. I can. More gently, she said, and closed her eyes. The ship hummed. The ark glowed from within. Lyra's hair lifted as if wind had found her in a sealed cabin. When she spoke, it was in her own voice. We came because you called. What would you have of me? The answer came as pressure against the bones of their heads, then translated itself, not into words but into meaning. Return the seed. Fold the branch back into the trunk. The world that stole must pay. Elian whispered, they think you are property. Lyra's eyes opened. They were wet, not from sorrow, but from inside out light. They think I am a mistake to be corrected. The ark's glow intensified. A band of energy reached toward the Astrovox, a tidal finger. Lyra lifted her hands and pressed her palms toward it as if to greet an old friend at the door. The energy split around her fingers and braided. Elian heard, terribly and tenderly, something like a lullaby sung by Glacius Virinth, Lyra said, and her voice carried into the reef. I am what happens when you talk to fire. I am what happens when waves cross. He answered with history images, poured through Lyra's mind and into Elion's by reflection. A war so old it made pyramids look like children. Weapons shaped like myths because myth was a tool like any other. Dragons bred to channel stellar plasma, to eat the energy of suns and hold it like breath. They had been passed from hand to hand. Their makers were ash on some long wind. They had slept because sleep was the only honest answer to what they had been asked to do. Now waking, they found their own song sung by others, and so they had come to take it back. Lyra listened to the terrible tenderness and bowed her head. I am sorry you were made for hunger, she said. I am sorry you were taught teeth instead of hands. The ships tugged at the ark. The ark breathed. Elian had the absurd and precise thought that he should have brought another sweater because the cabin had grown cold. He laid his palm on Lyra's shoulder. She was warm. It felt like a blessing someone had forgotten to remove. I think they will pull me apart, she said calmly. If they do not understand a bridge, they will break it to see what it is made of. Then we teach, Elian said, and the quiet steel in his voice surprised him. How? Lyra asked. With the time we have, with all the small, patient things. He told her to breathe. He told her to think of the gardens of the tomatoes, whose skins were thin enough to feel the sun. Of the vines that learned the pattern of her footsteps and unfolded when she came near. He reminded her of the way she played the little metal flute at night for the ship's maintenance bees, of how the bees had learned her pattern, and how the circuit of learning had closed so that she often followed them without thinking. He reminded her of the way she had chosen to put a book back on a shelf to go listen to the rain. He reminded her of laughters and quiets. He gave her human things to hold in her hands, the bright stones you pocket on a beach because your fingers cannot believe that this smoothness came from old storms. Lyra smiled, a small thing, almost private. Thank you, she said. I like the bees. Take them with you, he said. She turned to the ark and sang not with her mouth, but with all the instruments she was. Once Elian had told her that the first time he saw an aurora, he had stood and wept because the sky had decided to write poetry. Now he watched Lyra write back. The ark's energies brushed the song, probed it, tasted it. The dragons moved closer, patterns like constellations running down their luminous sides. Virinth's answer thickened the air. Little thief, you wear our fire and pretend it is yours. She replied, only the river decides its banks. I am both, he pressed. Return, fold, erase, she answered. Learn, and then the pressure changed. It became a blade. Energy lanced toward the ship, toward Lyra, toward the bright seed inside her that had been cut from their choir and taught another melody. Her body arched. Elian did not think. He threw himself between her and the incoming heat, an absurd gesture in a landscape of suns and song. But he had always believed that the smallest acts could be the hinge of bigger doors. The energy caught him, and everything went white and very quiet. For a long moment there was no Astrovox, no ark, no orbit, no man. There was only a falling, delicate as Lyra caught it. She caught Elian's light as if it were a glass she was too strong to hold. She cupped her hands around it and used it as one more instrument among the many she was learning. She streamed it through the lattice of the ark and let it be seen. "This is love," she wrote. "Not a chain, but a choice. Not a wound, but a window." Virenth paused, and that pause, that humble fraction of a second, was enough for a new thing to exist, curiosity without hunger. He saw, as through a door held open, a lab with a plant in a corner, a badly drawn dragon on a scrap of paper, a girl learning the patience of tomatoes, a man holding night vigil, a city breathing under a shell of light, bees knowing a tiny song. He tasted the texture of choosing. It was unfamiliar. It was not weakness. It was a different structure of strength. The ark's energies gentled in the way glaciers can be gentle when they decide not to crush a valley, only to hold it in a cold, blue silence. Lyra lowered her hands. Elian's body had slumped in the harness. He breathed shallowly. He was alive as a candle is alive in a windy room. Lyra spoke again, and this time she used words because there were things best said plainly. "I cannot come back into your choir as I was. I am a new instrument. If you try to make me a copy of the old, I will break. But if you let me sing at the edge of your song, I will keep your histories. I will hold your names." Virenth made a sound like molten glass cooling. He asked, not with suspicion now, but with gravity, "Why?" "Because no one else should forget you," she said simply. "Because you were made to burn and you learned to sleep, and I think that is very brave. Grace is a choice. So is mercy." The dragons, who had been used as instruments for too long, chose, in that suspended moment, to be something else. Audience, teacher, student all at once. Virenth gathered his light and folded it. The ark dimmed to a slow tide. The pressure withdrew. In the silence that followed, Lyra learned a new kind of quiet, one that hummed like a mountain when you press your ear to it. "Take him home," Virenth said at last. "Return when the water is calm again. There are more songs." They turned. The Astrovox came alive by inches, grumbling softly, like a friend roused from needed sleep but willing to rise. Lyra guided the ship out of the rift, past the dragons, who watched with long, reflective eyes. One dipped its head as they passed. It was not a bow. It was an acknowledgement. The journey back was slow. In the cabin, Elian's breath deepened, catching, smoothing. Lyra stroked his hair and told him stories the way he had told her of barnacles, of bees, of summers even she had not lived. She whispered that she had been afraid and was not ashamed. She whispered that the word brave had many shapes and not all of them were teeth. Above Neo-Tokyo, the shield flickered like a film on old glass. The dragons had already left low orbit, their wake glittering like dust. The city lights seemed brighter than before, as if happiness had been turned up a little to compensate for the fear that was draining away. Lyra put the ship into a long, gentle approach, like a bird folding down to a familiar nest. Rhea Solan's voice broke in. "Vox, report." Lyra smiled at the sound of the Admiral's practical concern, even softened with exhaustion. "We are intact," she said. "Elian needs rest." "I'll meet you at Dock 3, Rhea said, which was exactly enough and not more. They sat down. The ramp lowered. The air of the city rose to meet the metal and salt and the green breathing of the gardens. Rhea was there, the tightness in her shoulders easing when she saw the rise and fall of Elion's chest. Med teams came. Quiet hands moved him. He stirred long enough to catch Lyra's gaze and whisper, "Barnacles," and smile, and slip under again with trust. Lyra watched him go and then stood alone on the ramp, feeling the new quiet in her bones. She looked up. Above the city the sky was still deep, still full, but different. It had learned a word. Days passed, and then weeks. People told each other the story, even when it could be verified by data, because stories make data a place you can live. They said that the dragons had come and not killed them because a girl had asked them a question and waited for the answer. They said a scientist had stepped into a wave and made the wave consider its shape. Children drew bright, long creatures on paper and hung them in windows. Old men spoke softly in parks about how sometimes standing still is an act so large it adds a new branch to the tree of the world. Elian healed the way the sea heals first with storm, then with quieter tides. He woke to find Lyra asleep in a chair with a book on her chest, and he cried because gratitude will do that. He told her one morning that the tomatoes were late, and she told him perhaps they were thinking, and they both laughed. Lyra learned to walk the city the way one walks an instrument, in tune. She stood on bridges and watched clouds drift as if they were practicing generosity. She listened to the maintenance bees and copied their little pattern on her flute. She visited the ocean at dawn and let the waves teach her how to end and begin at the same time. She returned, sometimes, to the Astrovox and sat in its cabin and sang to the dark where the rift lived, not to summon or to plead, but simply to remind the threads that they were connected. One night, Elian found her there and sat beside her without speaking. They watched the harbor lights. After a while he said, "I used to think answers were everything. Now I think questions are what keeps the world moving." She took his hand. "I brought back a question," she said. "It sits in my chest. It is warm. It is heavy. What is it?" "How much of what we are do we choose?" she said. "And how much is the tide?" "I think the answer changes with the moon." He nodded. "We can learn to read the moon." They went back to the lab. They watered the tomatoes. They fixed the latch on the beehive. Lyra drew another dragon on a scrap of paper, this one kinder. Elian framed it, not because it was good, the lines were still awkward, but because it was true. On a late summer evening, the sky grew pale, and the wind turned in that way it does when season and time shake hands. Lyra stood at the open window in her shawl and listened. Far off, beyond instruments, beyond names, a deep music moved like whale song under ice. She smiled with her whole face, which made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with scales or light. More songs. Elian asked from the table, where he was repairing the hinge of a field kit with slow, careful fingers. "More songs," she said. "They're curious. They want to know the taste of rain." "Bring an umbrella," he said, and that made her laugh, and the sound of it wove itself into the city so thoroughly that someone decided not to be cruel that day and didn't know why. They did not know what the next season would bring, only that there would be one. Lyra felt the edges of it the way you feel the boundary between sleep and waking. She stretched her hands. Light woke in her palms, friendly, familiar. Not a weapon. A candle. She leaned on the windowsill and looked out at the quiet, living night, the ocean with its soft, secret work, the city with its million beating hearts, the sky full of alphabets not yet read. She closed her eyes and spoke not to gods or machines, but to the thing that braids all those into a world. "Thank you," she whispered. I'll keep singing. And because gratitude is a physics of its own, something far away turned its bright face no face toward her and listened. The listening traveled, step by step, to the empty spaces in other hearts, and those hearts, noticing that they had been noticed, softened by a fraction. It was small. It was everything. When sleep finally came to the lab, it came like a tide coming home. Elian slept deeply for once, one hand still smudged with oil from the hinge. Lyra slept with her cheek on her arm, her breath steady, her hair a spill of night across the pillow. The glyphs along the cradle made a gentle, slow pattern, like stars moving on a map too large for the human eye, but comforting all the same. Outside, the city dreamed of flying things that did not burn, and the sea eased itself against the pillars of the world. The dragons, wherever they drifted, dreamed too, and their dreams, finding the frequency of Lyra's breath, hummed a soft harmony, as if the galaxies themselves had exhaled. Morning took its time coming. When it finally did, it rose without announcement, slipped its light along the floor, poured itself into cups and corners, and asked no questions at all. Some days, even in 3030, the best thing you can do is let the light in and remember that bridges can be people, and that the future is often just an old song sung by a new voice.